I got to talk to Jeremy Crawford about Unearthed Arcana's subclasses, which ones he thought were incredibly successful, and which ones missed the mark.
Great example of feedback affecting where we're going to take design are two subclasses that we've done in the last few months. One of them was the Sharpshooter for the fighter. We got the feedback in. We looked at the satisfaction level, and it was quite low. Low enough that after looking at the subclass, we thought, really, as a design for the game, the official game, this is a dead end. People can still use the Unearthed Arcana Sharpshooter that we sent out in their home games if they dig it, it works for their group, it's fun for them, but given the low level of satisfaction, that piece of design is unlikely to ever appear officially in the game. In contrast, satisfaction for the cleric subclass, the Forge domain, was so high that we had to then pause and consider where in our upcoming product schedule could we find a place to include this, because satisfaction is crazy high. People loved it. And so that's a case of that satisfaction, and then also the reading, and then also the written feedback that we received, pushing us to look at this thing and see, where can we place this? Where can this show up in a later book to really become a part of the game itself? The Sharpshooter, I think, pun intended, missed the mark, partly because it did something that sometimes rubs players the wrong way, and that is it was stepping on other people's turf. The Sharpshooter, I think, had a bit too much of the Sharpshooter feat in it, in addition to sharing the feat's name, which never would have survived into print. We would have changed the subclass's name. It had a little too much of, I think, what people consider to be the Ranger's turf. It felt, I think, for people too much of a kind of an amalgamation of things they'd expect to see elsewhere in the game, or that they were already seeing elsewhere in the game. Because often when people get a new option, even if it has parts that they're familiar with, they want to feel overall that there really is something fresh there. And I think the Sharpshooter, again, it suffered from a variety of things. Maybe didn't feel quite fresh enough, maybe using a bit too many familiar parts and encroaching on the turf of other options that were already in the game. The Forge domain, in contrast, filled a gap that people suddenly noticed. And it's funny, sometimes people will communicate a gap to us. They'll say, here's the thing I want in the game that the game is not currently giving me, please give it to me. Other times, we'll introduce something, say an Unearthed Arcana, and people will realize, this is a gap I wasn't aware of, but now that you're filling it, I noticed it, and I'm glad you're filling it. And the Forge domain actually is something we had originally experimented with including in the 5th edition Player's Handbook. At the time, we were coming at it from a slightly different story angle. It was the creation domain at the time, and it sort of dead-ended in our design cycle as we were writing the 5th edition Player's Handbook. So we put it on a shelf, and we walked away for a while. But then when we were working on this current series, we brought it back, we reskinned it, we came at it from the angle of the Forge, particularly imagining the many different blacksmith gods that exist in the D&D multiverse, because pretty much almost every pantheon in the D&D multiverse has a blacksmith in it. And so we considered it was actually a kind of a weird gap in our domain system, that we didn't have a domain that specifically spoke to the smithing and the creation of things. Now, many of our smith gods have been able to rely on other domains. Like a number of smith gods often have sort of fire as a part of their aesthetic, so many of those gods could be represented by the light domain, for example. So there were places for a cleric of a smith god to go in terms of domain. But I think, again, the Forge domain really fits into a spot nicely that we had left open. And we knew this, again, going all the way back to the design of the Player's Handbook, because we had already started experimenting with something like it then. But again, feedback was really high, And so the Forge domain has a good chance of, at some point, appearing in a book.